So, thank you to the new voice of God. We share a profession. I have a little bit of housekeeping for everyone before we move on to the very exciting next panel on defense, which is that not only have we told you some very interesting things on the stage, but we also have some really exciting written research for you all to read when you go home. The notebooks that have been given to you in the bags have this wonderful card with a QR code. Have a look. There are 6 reports, I think, so all very interesting. It goes straight to them, and there's one very interesting one on defense spending, of course, by my friend Julia Friedlander, on critical minerals. Basically, all the themes of the panels are covered by our research, so do feel free to have a look. And now it's my privilege to welcome the panel, so please come up. So we have a very large and distinguished panel to discuss this very important topic. I'll introduce them very briefly, and then we'll go straight into the meat of the topic. So we have Fran Burwell, distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council. Thank you very much for being here, Fran. We have Jens Bodo Koch, CEO of Heckler and Koch, Tomas Pojar, Czech National Security Advisor, Mujtaba Rahman, Managing Director for Europe at Eurasia Group, and Nils Schmid, the Parliamentary State Secretary of the German Federal Ministry of Defense. So the ambition here is we have a little bit more time than for the Still panel. In about 50 minutes, we'll be discussing funding European defense and the path to 5%. So you all know where the 5% comes from. This was agreed at the NATO summit in June. 3.5% for core defense spending, and then an additional 1.5% for infrastructure spending. But there are many questions, of course, and Ambassador Whitaker this morning brought up some of the issues. I think it was quite interesting to all of us that he was talking about economics, almost the same amount as talking about defense and defense posture. Mentioned, for instance, that Belgians work a bit less on average than Americans per week. And so we're going to try, I think, to talk about not just how we fund this fiscally, but how we find efficiencies to make this possible and make Europe's build-up possible. And of course, this being a transatlantic conference, the role of the US will be discussed on this panel too. What is the balance between achieving strategic autonomy and maintaining the alliance? Could that alliance be harmed by strategic autonomy, or are these actually mutually reinforcing? So I thought if we could start with the Parliamentary State Secretary, so Mr. Schmid. Germany actually got a sort of good scorecard this morning from the ambassador. He said that Germany's increase in spending might actually pull everyone towards closer to an average of 5% faster. So I'm sure you were happy to hear that. But in a little bit more detail, I was wondering if you could comment on what exactly Germany intends to spend the additional military spending on, and also what your vision is for these sort of synergies. You want, and you've commented yourself, saying that you want Germany to engage in more defense partnerships within Europe. So what's your vision for that? Thank you.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm pleased to be in Brussels for this very important conference. Let me start by telling you that there's a rock-solid commitment of Germany to spending more on defense and to sticking to the new spending targets set by NATO in The Hague. And you can be sure that this commitment will remain for 3 reasons. First of all, German politics, in a transpartisan manner, very much is committed to these spending goals. So the next government, which will most probably be another coalition government, will be formed of parties that are also in favor of NATO and will continue the course set by the current coalition. Secondly, we changed the constitution. So we have almost unlimited spending power, which is very important for planning security, also for the private sector and for the defense companies in Germany and our partners elsewhere. And thirdly, Germany has the fiscal leeway to do so, since our debt is, well, not as high as in other Western countries, so we can afford some borrowing. Well, we should not overdo it, certainly, but we can use the financial firepower which was set free by the constitutional amendment. So that's a very important feature, I think, for the years to come, that Germany is a center stage when it comes to spending sufficient money on defense. And we will have to do two things. One is to fill the gaps in in our conventional arsenals, more ammunition, more tanks, more blinded vehicles, and more armored vehicles, and the like. And the second is to start innovating drones, software-defined defense, and else. And the good thing is that since we have so much fund available, we can do both, and we can engage in a lot of partnerships with NATO allies, with European partners, with American partners. So I think Germany can be an engine for defense cooperation and for strengthening the European defense base, since European defense is lagging behind. So in order to take on more responsibility in Europe, well, we need to spend more on defense as Europeans, but we will also have to buy more European stuff from European companies. Otherwise, this will not work out. This does not refrain us from buying American. We did so by acquiring F-35 fighter planes and by purchasing Patriots and systems and stuff like that. But basically, it will be about enhancing the European defense base. Yeah.
Thank you. Could I just follow up very quickly? I understand that the 5% means that there will probably be room both to still buy US kit off the shelf, but also to invest in some European, new European partnerships. But I was wondering, just as you now approach this, you have to get to 5%, you say by 2030, how will you prioritize between the two? I understand that abstractly there is room for both, but there will always be tensions, I think. And then within Europe, sometimes there are tensions between different arms manufacturers. They don't necessarily want to work together, or they want to keep their own independence and their close relationship with their army, so the German army and German manufacturers. These tensions do exist. I think it would be wrong to deny them. So how do you want to accompany this push for more synergies?
Well, NATO has set a very clear goal, which is to be combat ready by 2029. That's what I understood. That is also a part of the military planning in Germany. So we have to speed up procurement, and very often this means more or less buying existing stuff. And since Germany is committed to provide a lot of land warfare capabilities inside NATO and logistics, we can recur to a lot of existing products which primarily come from German manufacturers. So if you look at tanks, armored vehicles, a lot of artillery, this is basically produced in Germany and Europe. Well, when it comes to these huge gaps we have in air defense and deep precision strike capacity, we most probably will have to engage in partnerships with American firms, at least in the short term. But at the same time, these are key technologies which should also be mastered in the future by European companies and European governments.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to talk to Tomas, Pojar, the Czech National Security Advisor. So Czechia has also committed to reach a higher goal by 2030, I think of 3% of GDP spending. Prague has also been behind some very innovative solutions to problems since the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which started almost 4 years ago. At some points there have been bottlenecks and problems supplying the Ukrainians, and Prague has been behind some really quite innovative solutions that have gotten us through the bottlenecks. So I was wondering if you could provide that specific Czech view, which has been pragmatic and gotten us through some of the bottlenecks. But between now and 2030, there's going to be more spending, purchases from the US, also hopefully some new European defense partnerships. But what's your specific Czech view on this?
Thanks. Well, first of all, we have a goal to reach 3% by 2030. It's quite achievable. So it's the matter of political will. There is no budgetary issues regarding to that, or no significant budgetary issues. And that doesn't include the 1.5% for the infrastructure or additional costs, where we are almost 1.3% of 1.5% we are already like doing. So to reach 5% by 2035, it's really achievable. It's just a matter of political will, which is important, and it may not be there, but it's not the matter of macroeconomics. Then, when you mentioned the creative solutions, so we strongly believe that capitalism works. And if you allow capitalism to work, even in the defense industry and in the supplies, well, surprisingly, it works. So there is no shortage of ammunition in the world market. So if you cannot produce on your own, so you buy elsewhere. You can buy, you can deliver, and it's not so difficult. Until you have your own capacity, and then naturally you, of course, spend domestically, because it's politically important, it's economically important, and it's important for the security of supply. And I think we have to go this direction and this way in Europe. And by more spending, there is going to be an economy of scale when the American companies will be coming to Europe with production, and we will be demanding them coming to Europe with production. Because 10 years ago, to demand Raytheon to produce Patriot missiles again in Germany, it didn't have any sense, because the orders were so low that there was no economy of scale behind it. Now there would be economy of scale, and it's quite natural to say, okay, we will not replicate exactly Buy American Act, but we will have some kind of Buy European system, which is understandable. And whatever can be produced in Europe by Europeans or Americans or Israelis or South Koreans, then we should insist on having the production in Europe, and that will be comparative advantage to others. In some elements, we will not be able to produce, because we will not have our own productions, our own technologies, and then we will be more dependent on buying elsewhere, like buying in US and having. But I think if we deregulate at least a little bit, if we really put forces of capitalism at work, then defense industry will be fine, and we will be fine with supplies.
Thank you. And very briefly before we go to Mij, but isn't this exactly the tension that has existed? So the Czech initiative worked, and that's wonderful, but there was a little bit of pushback from other member states of the EU suggesting that already we need to be investing a certain threshold or putting a certain threshold into European solutions.
Well,
everyone
was freed and allowed to invest, but first of all, to sell something, you have to be able to produce it. So, and this was, our system has been completely voluntary. It's like a clearinghouse, and whoever wants to contribute decides fully what they are buying from whom, for how much, and when is the delivery time. And so it's not us micromanaging it. It is the others to contributing this way. And surprisingly, if the donors see that there is a production in Europe, then of course they buy in Europe, and they don't go elsewhere. Or if there is it doesn't have to be full production, because there is not that much full production in Europe still. But if there is an assembly in Europe, of course they prefer the European way, and everyone does that. Everyone prefers cheaper, safer, and the European way if it's there. So it has also contributed to several European companies, including Czech companies, in the large caliber and whatever caliber ammunition, to invest more and to beef up production. And the Czech companies were the best in beefing up production, even surpassing Rheinmetall in that sense, in the volume.
Did you find that any initially skeptical capitals came round to your way of seeing things?
Okay, we have been joined by, it depends how you calculate, by 15 capitals. Yeah. I think Europe is divided into the north and south, and it will be more divided into the north and south with more defense spending and more support of Ukraine, etc. I hope that we will still belong rather to the north than to the south as Czechs after the elections, but that will be seen. But we are definitely more there than in the south traditionally. And there you could see like more spending and more contributions. And there were some countries which I don't want to name, but they said it's a brilliant idea. They didn't contribute. Okay, fine. It's everyone's choice what anyone can do. But it has to be competitive. So if you have your own production which is so extremely expensive that only yourself you can buy it because nobody else is going to buy from you, and you will lose a lot of money, then at the end it's not sustainable.
Well, you didn't name the country, but I think we understood.
It's a big country.
Understood. Midge, we're talking about money. Both of the countries that are represented and have just spoken say they don't have fiscal problems and can, or at least can achieve this, and this is entirely achievable from a macroeconomic perspective. I tend to agree, but they're not the only two countries in Europe. There are some that face much bigger fiscal difficulties and contradict some of their ambitions. So you've written that Europe needs to go further even than the SAFE fund, which is already 150 billion for partnerships. It needs to go to the COVID scale on borrowing. So could you tell us a little bit more about how that would work and whether you've had any response when you've suggested this?
So the SAFE facility is interesting because it's an interest rate subsidy because the Commission can borrow more cheaply from capital markets than countries with high deficit and debt levels. And so from that perspective, it is interesting for the French, for the Italians, but it doesn't really, I think, go far enough because it doesn't address the fundamental fiscal and political problem many of the large member states are confronting. I do think the Commission's playbook on security and defence issues is mirroring what it did on COVID. So it's, if you think about 2020, the Commission created a platform for joint procurement to sponsor the production of vaccines within Europe. The second iteration of the policy response was the Shore facility, which was again borrowing for loans to support domestic furlough programs across the EU. And only the third iteration, once that facility, 100 billion euros, had been exhausted, was to do next generation grant financing. So Commission borrowing, passing that money on to countries in the form of non-repayable grants, and that money then being used to support the Union's geostrategic goals. At that point, it was the green transition, digitization. If you think about where we are today, we've effectively gone through the first two of those iterations. So as the two previous speakers have spoken about, we now have legislation in Europe that promotes use of European money for domestic suppliers and fosters joint procurement. And the 150 billion SAFE facility will be exhausted. 19 member states have requested its use. I think the numbers go north of 150 billion. And so I suspect in a context where the geopolitical environment deteriorates further, and that may not happen, it may happen, the next, I think, question will be, does Germany in particular agree to use its balance sheet to enable more grant financing for countries that really don't have the fiscal space to get to 5%? And I think, when I think of that collection of countries, I would absolutely put France top of mind. There is no pathway to 5% for France in light of the political and fiscal turbulence that country is experiencing. But even the UK, I think the outlook on the 5% target is very challenging.
Okay. Any response from Germany on that idea?
Well, I think Mitch is right in his analysis that there is a growing discrepancy in terms of fiscal capacity among European allies. So sooner or later we have to deal with that, either on a national or on a European level. But I want also to point out that in the German political debate, this is of course highly controversial. So progressive forces like my party and the Green Party tend to be more open to some European joint funding vehicle, whereas conservative parties like the Christian Democrats and the Liberals are firmly opposed to that. So for any German government, this will be a very difficult way to go, especially with Chancellor Merz throwing away one fiscal taboo by amending the constitution on the debt brake. For him, it will be very difficult during this term to throw away or to overcome the next fiscal taboo. So I think it's a complicated matter in terms of politics, but also in terms of constitutional law, because there are also very tight constraints coming from the jurisprudence of our Supreme Court on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And never forget Karlsruhe, absolutely.
Yeah.
So if I could come to you, Fran, from an American perspective, although you know Europe well and you're here very often. So you've written recently about your concerns about how this will lead to more divergence. I think most people here care about the transatlantic relationship. They will have different views on where it should go. But you see Europe, you think Europe's plans are serious?
Yeah.
And think that, therefore, a few years from now, some of the ties that still bind us could be dilapidated by some of these plans. So tell us more.
So I think you have to look at both sides of the equation, both sides of the Atlantic, because I do think that as Europe does more of its own financing, and I've already heard here and certainly have heard outside in the coffee break a lot about European preferences. But I think from the other side of the Atlantic, there is also a move away from Europe. So I think the Trump administration is very fractured in terms of its decision making. President Trump is the main decision maker. He has made this deal at NATO, and he supports it, and I think he sees this as one of his successes. But he's now on to other things. And I don't expect him to really return his attention to this issue until the 5% issue, until we get closer to the summit in Turkey next year. He will look at who is providing weapons for Ukraine, and as you know, we are not just giving weapons to Ukraine anymore. We are looking to Europe to buy those weapons. At the same time, there are issues with American supply. There are backlogs in terms of production. So even if Europeans wanted to buy some of the material that we make, they have a long waiting list and a long wait time, and that's not especially good for the Ukrainians. But even more important, I think, is the decision-making in the Pentagon, where there are people who don't want us to be in Europe, or only in a limited sense, and who are reluctant to have US weapons come to Europe because they believe that they need to be stockpiled for a potential invasion of Taiwan, to be blunt. And there's a new national security strategy that will come out in the next couple months. From what we know from press reports of what it's looking like, it will emphasize defense of the immediate territory of the United States, so potentially more hits on drug boats in the Caribbean, that kind of thing, as well as the use of the military in the United States, as we've also seen, and a focus on China. So is there divergence going on? Yes, there is. And there will be those in the States who will point to a Buy European clause and be very upset about it. I hope that there would be a way to modify, because there are many US defense companies who are employing workers here in Europe. And so a made in Europe as opposed to just a Europe owned may be a medium ground that we can look to. But I think it's not just about what's happening in Europe, it's also about a United States that is moving away in a different direction.
Understood. And since we're being blunt, we can talk about some of the rumors that have gone around since President Trump's return. I mean, some European buyers have started rethinking their procurement strategies. I mean, it wasn't a European leader, but the Canadian Prime Minister who talked about the US weaponizing its hegemony, and therefore that leading to people reconsidering what they should do. I think another episode that really concentrated minds was when the US shut down intelligence sharing with Ukraine. It only lasted a few days, but it's still mentioned to us at the Atlantic Council as a factor. So, I mean, there are many voices in the Trump administration, and they change their policy occasionally quite quickly. But I was wondering how that factored in as well. The sort of sense that the uncertainty in direction from the US is changing minds in Europe, even in countries that are traditionally quite transatlantic.
Let me just say that right now our relations with Canada are extraordinarily bad or challenging. So I think that is, you shouldn't take a Canadian statement as the way Europe should respond. I understand that view in Europe, and I hear it too, but I would say that actually the Europeans have been pretty successful in getting President Trump to understand their perspective. And I would take this meeting with I think 6 or 7 European leaders whom Trump introduced around the table to his audience, I mean, his constituents. So I think that whereas before Europe was struggling to get a hearing, I think they have convinced him. They've convinced him of the rightness of the Ukrainian cause. Have they convinced him that the U.S. should put its might behind that cause? No, I don't think so. That's a hot and cold thing, depending on the day. But I think they have opened the door and now have a consistent way of speaking to him that I think should alleviate some of those concerns.
Thank you very much. So before we go to our last speaker, last but not least, of course, the CEO of Heckler & Koch, I do have to ask the audience to prepare some questions. You can send them to me on askac.org and they'll appear on this iPad, but we will also have a roving mic, so please prepare some interesting, provocative questions. So Jens, thank you also for participating. So you represent the private sector, you're one of these defense suppliers. I suppose I have a twofold question. First of all, we clearly see from everything that's been said already that demand is exceeding supply. There's a lot of demand. So how are you preparing to increase scale? And I was wondering what are the better and more efficient signals that you need from governments and the proper incentives? Because there is a fear, and it's studied in one of our research pieces on how to make sure that the incentives are used efficiently. So what are the right signals? What works well for you to help you increase supply? That's the first question. And also, how are you preparing for this more cross-border dynamic? Cross-border synergies, supplying other partners than the German army, all of that. Thank you.
Let me start with your second question. We are a German-based firearms manufacturer, producing the finest firearms in the world, I would say. But we are truly transatlantic company, so we have a presence in the US since 50 years. We have a manufacturing site in the US. We have invested in products and production capabilities over the last years in Germany and in the US. And we delivered firearms to the best of the security forces in the US, but not only in the US, but worldwide. Or worldwide is not correct. To the Western world, worldwide, so sharing our values, meaning Europe, NATO-associated countries, and therefore Germany is not the biggest customer, it's one of our customers. With all the investments now being planned by the German government, their share will get bigger and bigger, but we have some 100 customers, also police forces, so we're not depending on one customer. Secondly, we are looking into Ukraine. We are delivering weapons into Ukraine to the special forces, and that really makes a difference. So there's innovation on the weapons, which we will see. So coming to your question, how do we prepare for the new demand? We've always been a company since 75 years learning from the missions of our customers. So we have constantly spent in product development. So we have like almost 100 engineers in the company. And for the production demand, of course, we have invested over the last 5 years more than 100 million euro. And to put that in perspective, we are a 300 million euro sales company. So 1/3 of the sales is invested over the last couple of years. And we prepare more investment packages now. So we will buy a new site, we will buy more machines in order to prepare for that new demand. We've always delivered to contract. We have never let down a military or law enforcement customer. Yeah. Civilian customer might have waited a bit longer for a weapon, but we've always focused on law enforcement and the military.
Thank you very much. So we already have a good few questions here, some very provocative, but I was thinking we would perhaps start in the room. We have a question right at the back. We'll start with the man behind you, and then we'll come to you, son. Go ahead.
Yeah, Martin Sandberg from the Financial Times. Thanks very much. A brief specific question to Nils Schmid and a general question to the panel, if I may. The specific question is, Chancellor Merz wrote in an op-ed in the FT on Thursday, I believe, that Germany now endorses a so-called reparations loan for Ukraine. And he mentioned the figure of 140 billion euros. So that's a large sum, which he wrote should be solely devoted to weapons, and suggested there should be some sort of European input in deciding what should be bought. So I was wondering if you could spell out what the policy really is there, and what is the wisdom behind saying all of the money should go to weapons and none to general budgetary support. The general question to whoever in the panel would like to answer is, one thing that often comes up in this debate, but hasn't really been touched on today, is the sort of multiplicity of specification, the fragmentation of production in Europe, and so on. A related problem is the lack of common procurement that was touched on very briefly. So the question is simply, how big of a problem is this? Can you put a sort of, give us a sense of the magnitude? How much does this destroy for Europe's capacities? And how much is being done? How fast are we actually remedying this problem, if at all? Thank you.
So I think we'll go to Nils on the specific German question.
Well, I think the idea spelled out by the Chancellor in your paper points to the urgency of arms deliveries to Ukraine in light of the current military situation. And it also stresses the point that in order to change Putin's calculus on the military side of his invasion, his aggression against Ukraine, you need a very strong, solid, and continuing military support for Ukraine. As long as Putin is convinced that he might or he can prevail militarily, he will continue the war in Ukraine, against Ukraine. And for 3 years now, we have been trying, by delivering weapons to Ukraine, to alter this calculus, to make Putin understand that there is no way ahead in terms of military victory. And I think the point of this proposal made by the Chancellor is to put this very much at the center stage of the political debate, the urgency, the pressing need to deliver as many weapons as possible to Ukraine, and to do this over the course, or to be prepared to do this over the course of the next few years, in order to show to Putin that we are in that for the long haul, and that we will not tire off delivering weapons to Ukraine. I think that's the political point behind that offer.
Thank you. We'll go to Midge in a second to answer maybe Martin's more general question. It's nice to see you, Martin, and have participated for a long time with you and others on this Russian assets saga. Also very nice from the Atlantic Council Geoeconomic Center's perspective to see some progress on this. My feeling is that, if I may answer, although I'm the moderator, that we're really at the beginning of this, exploring how this loan will work. When the ERA loans were agreed last June, by the G7, it took another 6 months for us to see how it would work technically. So we all very much encourage this work, but it's going to be, I think, quite complicated. Midge.
So Martin, I would basically reinforce Charles's point. I think the sense in the institutions in Brussels is the extraordinary revenue accelerator, the Ukraine facility, and in the Commission's MFF proposal, this wrapper on top of the proposal. It's those three vehicles that will ultimately do the civilian budgetary support for Ukraine proper. And it's this priority Ukrainian list initiative with the Trump administration that they are now trying to figure out a way to fund over the medium to long term in light of the national fiscal constraints member states are facing. And that's why I think the reserves primarily are going to be used for that initiative. But as Charles says, I think a lot of this is now going to be worked out within the guts of the Commission and ultimately come to the member states where it will be negotiated. So I think we're at the front end of that process.
Thank you. Fran, you had something to say?
Just a brief comment on the lack of common standards across the European defense companies and products. I think Europe is at the beginning of a process that the United States went through 2 decades ago, maybe. There's an infamous dinner when the companies were told by the Secretary of Defense that they had to get together and figure this out, and then that most of them would not survive. They'd be eaten by the big companies. And that's what happened, and it was painful. And I'm very skeptical about the member states themselves deciding whose supply lines, whose, for whichever munition you're talking about, or armored personnel carrier, is going to survive. My Czech friend here said capitalism works if you let it work. But if you determine that your companies are all national champions, then you won't be able to let capitalism work.
Pojar.
Yeah, but with those systems now so expensive and so sophisticated, then you cannot do it on the national level besides few countries. So it makes it more easier for consolidation. So I strongly believe that there is going to be this drive for consolidation. It has already started. You will see less fighting jets and less versions of tanks in the future than what you did see 20 years ago. And the way is then, yes, to voluntarily by the countries to decide and to go together with procurement. And this is already happening. Look, we are a good example of that, I think. We have gone to the CV-90 production with Sweden as being 6th or 7th or 8th country having this infantry fighting vehicle, with some portion given to the Czech industry because of security of supply and, of course, maintenance somehow linked to the Czech space. We have now done deal with Leopard tanks linking exactly to the German agreement with the company, so copying the procurement agreement and just making sure that there are also some Czech companies in the supply line. And even the F-35s, we have bought 24 F-35s, and 12 of them are going to be produced in Texas and 12 in Italy. So I think this is the trend which is going to be there wherever it is possible. Not in every product it is possible, but this consolidation will be there. And in few years, Heckler Koch will be bought by Czech competitors. So don't worry, there will be consolidation on this end as well. It almost happened, so there will be next chance.
So, Herr Koch, I have to give you the floor now.
We'll see. Actually, I love competition, because it brings out the best product for the women and men fighting for our freedom, So what we see is national egoisms and countries buying at their national star or wherever, whenever there is competition, usually HK wins the competition.
Well, Colt Caesar is a bit bigger now, so...
Who?
Colt Caesar. It's a bigger company, so let's face it. Yeah.
I don't know where the beef comes from, but that's fine. We don't see them in competitions usually, so that's fine. Well, you can buy us, but you have to talk to the German government for that. So coming back to my point, we love competition, No, it's regulated in Germany, so they have not to ask us, but they have to ask the German government. We love competition because it brings out the best products, and what we see is national egoisms, and therefore not the interoperability that we would look for, not the standards we would look for, and I think that's not a big problem, but it is a problem. We see from Spain, France, Norway, Germany, Lithuania, Latvia buying HK weapons, so there is a kind of standard on the rifles. But there are some countries who protect their own industry, and I think that's a problem.
Thank you very much. We have another question from you, sir. And if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Thank you, Charles. Oleg Dunda, member of Ukrainian Parliament. Very short question. At least NATO summit, we have had very big decision, challenge to make bigger military budget, defense budget. But at the same time, we have a lot of problem in public finance in Europe. First of all, in public finance in France, in German. And after that, we will able to have risk to have in this country social crisis, and after that, political instability in Europe. So, my question, what kind of opportunities do you see to reduce risk of conflict between public finance in Europe and defense budget?
Thank you. I think, Mij, that one's for you.
So look, I don't think there's an answer to that question in the French case. So to ballpark these numbers, France's defense budget for this fiscal year is 62 billion. Germany's is 86, so not incomparable, but by the end of the decade, Germany will be at 150 billion and France hopes to achieve 80, which is 3% of GDP. I don't see how a minority government with no pathway to get a budget deal through Parliament can deliver on that commitment. And that equilibrium, I think, will basically remain the same between now and 2027. Maybe Le Cornu will fall, a caretaker may come in, maybe a technocrat will come in, they may be censured, Macron may have to call an early election. The domestic political picture is a complete mess, and it's not going to resolve itself before a presidential election in April or May. And hopefully that president will then be enabled with a parliamentary majority in the summer of that year. And that may create the basis for a conversation about how France can then get to 3.5% or 5% by 2035. The UK, it's outside of the EU, situation's a bit better, but I think equally challenging. And so I come back to my point earlier, and Nils will have more to say on this. I do think Merz's instincts on this question of common financing are different than his party. I think there is huge indigestion within the CDU on the right. Within the deep state, they're reasserting themselves in light of the abolition of the debt brake, in light of the infrastructure fund. But my sense is, Merz and the team around him, they're looking for cover. So when there is not, just as Merkel looked for cover during the COVID crisis to make the big move on next generation EU, and I don't think that is for today. It may not even be this mandate, maybe the next mandate. But I genuinely don't think there is if you're talking about credible collective European defense, you require the French as an active participant in that discussion. I don't see how you do it without a big move in Germany on common financing, just given the state of the public finances and the extent to which that's now intertwined with a very challenging political situation.
Usually it would be fair to take these questions on the German deep state to the Parliamentary State Secretary, but I think, Tomas, you wanted to come in.
Well, I think Germany will make money out of it, because if Germany releases this money for others to buy in Europe, then German industry will profit and German economy will profit. So I think it's wise for Germany to look in this direction, as it was in the past and as it will be now. But to respond to the question, it's you will see it much easier in the north and much more difficult in the south. And the most difficult it will be for the countries which have huge debts. That means very difficult or expensive borrowing. Are sometimes out of the Eurozone, because then the question is about the fluctuation of the currency rate, to put it, and which doesn't have, and who don't have their own defense industry, so they cannot invest anything into their own economy, meaning that they cannot say, yes, we are also creating our own jobs. So at the end, easier for North, worse for, or more difficult for South, but at the end, depending on country to country, also based on if there is a defense industrial base or not. And those who have defense industrial base, it will be easier there to argue for, because there the business will fight for it, if it's not shy. So business is usually shy these days in Europe. So I hope that once again, the European business will fight for itself, not like what we have seen in the last 10, 20 years, and I'm not talking only about defense business, but other business as well.
Thank you very much. I do have a few direct quick round questions from here on the pad, which I think would be fun to bring out. One for Nils, which is whether Germany will go with for FCAS with France, FCAS without France and with others, or GCAP.
Well, the German government is fully committed to the FCAS project. As we've seen over the last few years, this project very much depends on the political will of the governments, especially of the French and the German government, of course also the will of our Spanish friends. And there's an agreement which we should all stick to, and then it will move ahead. So we'll see over the course of the end of this year if we will have this political will still in place. But for Germany, very certainly, the continuation of the project is the most preferred option, of course. In the end, we need to learn to work together on major technology advances and the future combat air system, future air combat system is definitely one of those.
Thank you very much. So one final question from the pad, which I think is an important one because the word has not come up in this panel so far. And it has been a very good panel, but it is important to bring this word up, which is space. European military space capacity. Europe does have a space agency, but it does civilian space work for now. Will Europe simply accept that on this particular part of our future and on the future of military, we export or we outsource this to the US? Or what does Europe feel comfortable doing on future space military technologies? Would anyone like to take that? Go ahead.
Well, definitely we need to develop our own competences as Europeans. And my minister just gave a groundbreaking speech on that last week, in which he defined the challenges coming up from space, and in which he announced that Germany will spend up to 35 billion euros on that in the coming years. So I think we need to acquire our own capabilities and capacities as Germans and Europeans on that, definitely. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else? Well, the risk of being in this position is that we were in between what you were doing before on steel and lunch, and yet you have all stayed, which we're very grateful for, but I think that speaks to the quality of this panel. So thank you very much to our participants. And I have a little bit of housekeeping before we applaud them. We do have lunch sessions for those of you who are interested either in the future of cross-border payments, which will be a very good session led by my colleague Ananya Kumar. That's in 30 minutes. And then we have, after that, at 1:30 p.m., Ambassador Dan Fried, former US sanctions coordinator, talking about, moderating a panel on the new challenges in sanctions enforcement. So that's at 1:30, 30 minutes after the beginning of the first lunch session, which starts in 30 minutes. So now it's time to say bon appétit. Thank you for attending, and thank you to our excellent panelists. Thank you.